Hello guys, in this video we're ranking dinosaurs based on their accuracy from Jurassic Park. So we're going to be ranking them based on how good they were for their time and also compared to modern day representations. So let's get on with the video. So we'll be starting with the most iconic dinosaur of the franchise, the Tyrannosaurus Rex. So the Jurassic Park Tyrannosaurus Rex was actually very accurate for its time, though there are two things that were probably intentional that were not up to date. So, first, they gave it knife like teeth, but the actual T Rex had very thick, 1 inch long teeth with that are more shaped like railroad spikes and do look less scary on screen, so that's probably why they chose the knife like teeth. And the one that everyone knows, it can't see you if you don't move, which is obviously fake. The T-Rex could definitely see you if you don't move, so that's a very bad idea. So for its time, it's a solid 8 out of 10. But holding up to today, I wouldn't say so, because one, new T-Rex that we have today was much slower, only around 10 miles per hour, was much thicker, and also had even much better eyesight and could even had binocular vision. So because of these things, I would say the Jurassic Park T-Rex compared to modern standards only holds up to about a 6 out of 10, but still better than some other ones. So our next dinosaur is the Velociraptor. So if you can see it, it doesn't look that good, but it was based off of one of the other raptors, the Deinonychus. So for its time ranking, we'll be basing it off of Deinonychus, but for modern standards, no mercy at all. So compared to the Deinonychus, the Velociraptor of Jurassic Park have a seemingly decent resemblance with the Deinonychus skull. So, and besides for that, it actually does seem kind of decent. So comparing it to the Deinonychus of probably back then, this would be a solid 8.5 out of 10. But compared to the Velociraptor of today, this would be not even close. The skull shape, of course, is very wrong, as the Velociraptor had a much more narrow and different skull shape. Of course, the tail is much more flexible in the stiff Velociraptor tail. The size is, of course, like almost triple, maybe, the size of real velociraptors. And on top of that, the wrists are pronated, which is something I didn't mention about the T Rex. Same with the absence of lips, and also, of course, an absence of feathers. So, for that reason, I am giving the modern standard ranking as a very low 2.5 out of 10. So now we're going to do the first dinosaur to ever appear on screen in the entire series, the Brachiosaurus. Another interesting thing about the Brachiosaurus is that in 1993 there were two species, Alithorax and Branchi. But now Branchi has been reclassified to a new genus, Giraffatitan, which belonged in Africa. And the Jurassic Park Brachiosaurus was based off of what is now called the Giraffatitan. Similar to the Velociraptor, for its time, I'll use Giraffatitan as a base, and for modern standards, I'll use the actual Brachiosaurus elythorax. So, for its back in time, it was actually pretty decent. The cresting was mainly correct. The head, I think, was fine, and also, one thing that was wrong here is the feet, as the feet were not just straight up pillars, of course, they were a little more defined, but the straight up pillar isn't that accurate, I would say. It's not that off. But then one other thing that they got wrong is the nostril position, which is not on the crest, though I do not think that anyone knew that at the time. So for the time, it's a solid 9 out of 10. But for modern standards, yeah, not the same, because the differences between this and the modern Brachiosaurus is that, first of all, Brachiosaurus has a slightly longer tail than Giraffe Titan. It also has a less pronounced crest. Of course, we're going to take into consideration the pillar legs and the crest nostrils a lot more. And also the snout, like the jaw was a little shorter. So for those reasons, for modern standards, it will be a 6.9 out of 10. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Triceratops, if you guys all remember the scene. So basically, the Triceratops for its time was pretty good. There are two things I'd like to talk about though. One is the little cheekbone kind of thing. It's shown as having multiple little spikes on it, but it would actually just be like one little protrusion and would be a hole. It's not like divided like that. The second thing is the pillar like feet, which would obviously not be there. It would obviously be a little, the fingers would be a little more separated. Well, I guess not fingers, toes, but yeah, so with those two things, I would give, for its time, I would give it a 9 out of 10. But for modern standards, there is one more thing I would add to the list, and that is the frill shape, which is quite wrong. Like, for its time, like, this is, I guess, what they thought the frill shape would look like. But now, this is not at all what the frill shape would be. It is, like, a little curved in a weird way, so for that, for modern standards, I would give it a 8 out of 10. So the Parasaurolophus for its time is pretty good, though its crest was a little long compared to the real Parasaurolophus. And besides for that, I don't think there is much wrong with it. So for its time, it was, I would say, a 9 out of 10. But for modern standards, there are a couple more things. First of all, it has just a beak and cheeks, so like you wouldn't see most of its jawline, which is not something that would be accepted today. Another thing is that its front like fingers, I guess, or like on the front limbs, the fingers are very separated, and they are also pronated. But the real Parasaurolophus had them more conjoined compared to the Jurassic Park variant. And also, the Jurassic Park variant was a little thinner and more limb, while the current one is a little chunkier. So for those reasons, I think um, for modern standards, the Parasaurolophus would be a 7 out of 10. Next up is the Gallimimus. So for its time, the Gallimimus didn't have much wrong. I would say its head shape is slightly different than it should have been, but for the time, I think that's all that was wrong. So I'd give it a 9 for its time, a 9.5. But for modern times, there's a little more to add to the list. First of all, the Gallimimus, of course, has pronated wrists and also an absence of feathers. And also, it was slightly taller than its modern variant and had a little hump on its back instead of having a more flat one. So for that, I would give it a 7 out of 10. Oh, going to go on a roller coaster with this one. So the Dilophosaurus of Jurassic Park, for its time, had quite a bit wrong. So the frill and the poison thing were definitely made up, and their size was shrunk quite a bit. So for those two, or I guess you could say three things, I would give it a 7 out of 10 because of how unrealistic that is already. But compared to modern standards, it's gonna get worse. So on top of that, also the Dilophosaurus had probably had some kind of little feathering at the least, and also would have had lips, and also did not have pronated wrists. So with all of that taken into consideration, I think we can give the Dilophosaurus for its modern standards a very low 4 out of 10. So the Stegosaurus for its time was okay. So first of all, it was quite oversized. Another thing is that it's able to twist its tail to vertically smash its stagomizers, as seen in that one scene, but that's not possible. And another thing is that its body has quite a bit of a hump, which would not be the case. So for its time, I would give it a 7 out of 10. But for modern times, a couple more things to add to the list. So first of all, it had cheeks, which wouldn't be possible. And another thing is that the tail drooped down instead of going like straight up. Though they did fix that in Jurassic World Dominion. But so for that, I'm gonna give 6.5 out of 10. So the Compsognathus for its time was almost perfect, but they messed one thing up. They gave it three claws instead of two on its hands. So for its time, a 9.5 out of 10. For modern standards, I'd have to add a couple things. First of all, its lack of feathers. Second of all, it would be a little thicker in some parts of its body, like its legs. And lastly, its wrists were pronated. So for modern times, I'd give it a 7.5 out of 10. So for the Pachycephalosaurus, the only thing I can find wrong for its time was the fact that its tail was not exactly long enough. It was a little shorter than I think it should be. So for its time, I'd give it a 9.5. But for modern standards, I'll have to add to the list. So first of all, it had pronated wrist. It also had a cheek, which would not be there, and the beak might also not. And it was a little less chunky than maybe it should be. And also in Jurassic World, they increased the size for some reason, even though it used to be a proper size in the Lost World. But I won't fully consider that, so I'll give it a 7 out of 10. So the Mamenchisaurus for its time was, well, I'm not sure how to comment about it. The Mamenchisaurus hasn't had much discovery or anything, so it's not a very well reconstructed dinosaur. But from my understanding, for the time, one thing that they got wrong was that they made the tail like quite long, even though it shouldn't have been that long. So for its time, I'll give it a 8.5 out of 10. For modern standards, I think the Mamenchisaurus, first of all, was a little less chonky than it shouldn't have been, and also it held its neck in the wrong position. It was a little more leaning instead of straight up, as most people seem to reconstruct it. So, for modern standards, I'd give it a 7 out of 10. So for its time, the Spinosaurus was a little complicated. So back then, most remains of the Spinosaurus were destroyed in World War II. So the creators of the Jurassic Park Spinosaurus had very little to go off of. So the only thing I think I can say wrong with it is that its wrists are pronated. So I'll give it a 9 out of 10. But for modern standards, there can be more proper comparison. First of all, the neck was a little short on the real Spinosaurus. Second of all, the sail shape is wrong. Third of all, the tail of the real Spinosaurus was more adapted to aquatic lifestyle and was more like a flipperish shape. And lastly, the like limbs are a little shrunk. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention there's a little some stuff there wrong with the skull. So for modern standards, I'll give it a 3.5 out of 10. We are now reviewing the Ankylosaurus. So for the time, the Ankylosaurus had a couple things wrong. First of all, the Jurassic Park Ankylosaurus had quite longer legs. Second of all, it had a shorter neck than the real Ankylosaurus, which had a quite decently long neck, which was also kind of thick. It's like they took the head and pasted it on directly onto the body. So for the time, I'll give it an 8 out of 10. But for modern standards, I'll have to add a couple more things. First of all, the head shape is a little wrong. Second of all, the osteoderm placement is like completely wrong. As you can see on the Jurassic Park Ankylosaurus, it has one straight spiky osteoderm line running down the back, a couple of very unnoticeable ones next to it, and it's like an entire armor piece with very big spikes coming from the sides. In reality, the Ankylosaurus would have much smoother scales, osteoderms on its back, and they would also be there on the sides and on the upper part of the legs. And lastly, the it had cheeks, while the real Ankylosaurus would show its jawline more. And actually, another thing I forgot to mention is that the foot shape of the Ankylosaurus of Jurassic Park is a little like thick, and the front leg and the back left leg's feet are very similar, though there be more difference. So, for modern standards, I think I would give the Ankylosaurus a 4 out of 10. So the Corythosaurus of Jurassic Park 3 is relatively well compared to its real life possible counterpart. So for the time, one thing they got wrong was that they pronated the wrists. So for the time, I'd give it a 9 out of 10. But for modern standards, it's still not too bad. So first of all, the Corythosaurus is not really that chunky, even though it should have been a little fatter. And second of all, the Corythosaurus from Jurassic Park 3 is actually a little smaller than its real life variant, which is ironic since we're talking about Jurassic Park. And recently, some scientists believe that a lot of hadrosaurs might have had their front limbs, hands, like conjoined into hoof like structures. So, this may or may not have been true for the Corythosaurus. So, for modern standards, I'll give it a 7 out of 10. So the Ceratosaurus for its time was not too bad, though there are a couple things wrong. First of all, it had longer legs, which is a little common with Jurassic World and Park dinosaurs. Second of all, the ridges on its eyes were a little too small, which is a little weird for a Jurassic dinosaur since they're usually amplified to look scarier. Next, their wrists were pronated, and lastly, one actually big thing, it was too big. So for that, I'll give it a 7.5 out of 10. But for modern standards, we'll have to add a couple more things. First of all, it did not have lips. Second of all, its arms were kind of in the wrong position. Third of all, it had its body in like a kind of wrong posture, like the shape was a little wrong also. So for that, I'm giving it a 5.5 out of 10. So that's it for this video. We're gonna do another part later, so stay tuned for that. Bye.